The morning of July 29th, 1944, began with the taste of cordite. Outside St. Lo, the hedgerows were still burning from the previous night's artillery. Inside a battered M4 Sherman named Lucky 4, the air was worse, smoky, metallic, and humid with sweat. Corporal Tom Elliott had been awake for 36 hours. His loader, Private Frank DeAngelis, was on his knees, shirtless, arms slick with oil and grime, methodically restacking shells inside the turret basket, while everyone else dozed. The tank had taken 2 near misses the day before, German high-explosive rounds that blew the left track guards off and warped the ammo racks behind the gunner's seat. The crew called it a miracle that the propellant hadn't cooked off. Their commanding officer had ordered them to fall back to a maintenance line. Instead, Frank DeAngelis spent the night reorganizing 77 pounds of ordnance into what he later called the only shape that made sense. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. No one else in Lucky 4 understood what he meant until the next morning, when German armor appeared across the bocage and the tank fired 12 rounds in under a minute. To understand why that mattered, one has to understand what it meant to fight from inside a Sherman in the summer of 1944. The M4 series was not a death trap, despite what later legends claimed, but it was a compromise, a machine built for mass production, mechanical reliability, and global logistics, rather than brute survivability. Its 75mm M3 gun could fire a high-explosive shell at 2,000 feet per second, or an armor-piercing round capable of penetrating roughly 3 inches of steel at 500 yards. On paper, respectable. Against a German Panther or Tiger, practically suicidal. Every Sherman. Crewmen learned that the hard way. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, German tanks seldom moved alone. They lay in ambush at crossroads and tree lines, firing the first shot from concealment. American armor doctrine expected Shermans to advance under smoke and artillery support, but the bocage made that impossible. Crews fought in fields the size of backyards, separated by earthen walls 5 feet thick. Engagement distances dropped to 50 yards or less. At those ranges, survival depended not on armor thickness or gun caliber, but on seconds on who could see, traverse, load, and fire first. The official firing cycle for a Sherman 75mm gun, as recorded in the U.S. Army's 1943 Technical Manual TM 9731-A, averaged between 6 and 8 seconds per shot under ideal range conditions. That meant roughly 8 to 10 rounds per minute when stationary. Combat, of course, was not ideal. The loader had to reach down into the hull rack, heave a shell weighing between 15 and 25 pounds depending on type, align the rim into the breech, shout, "Up," step clear, and brace as the gun recoiled. Most crews sustained 3 to 4 rounds per minute in battle. Frank DeAngelis, a 23-year-old former steel mill apprentice from Pennsylvania, thought that was unacceptable. According to the after-action report filed by First Lieutenant James H. Rowe of the 3rd Armored Division, DeAngelis's crew achieved an unprecedented sustained rate of 12 shots in 60 seconds during the engagement east of St. Lo. The report calls it anomalously high. What the paperwork doesn't capture is why it happened, or how much of it was the product of one loader's compulsive rethinking of physics inside a 5-by-7-foot turret. When he joined the Army in 1942, DeAngelis hadn't been assigned to armor at all. He'd been trained as an ordnance clerk, but his mechanical aptitude and sheer physical strength could press a 70-pound shell one-handed landed him in a tank crew by the spring of 1944. Sherman loaders worked in a space smaller than a broom closet. The ammunition racks lined the hull floor and sidewalls, protected by thin sheet metal guards meant to prevent fragments from igniting the propellant. Each round, high explosive, armor-piercing, smoke, or white phosphorus, was stored vertically in its own cradle. Regulations demanded that loaders pull from the ready rack, a small group of shells near the breech designed for quick access. Once those were gone, he had to reach down into the hull or pivot awkwardly to the side bins, costing precious seconds. During a lull in combat outside St. Lo, DeAngelis studied the rack layout and realized something none of the manuals addressed. The Sherman's internal design assumed a front-to-back workflow loader pulls shell from right, swings left, inserts into breech. But in practice, that forced him to twist, his spine nearly 90 degrees each time, wasting both energy and seconds. So, he changed the geometry. He emptied the lower hull racks completely, stacked the shells horizontally on the turret floor, alternating armor-piercing and high-explosive, with their bases aligned toward the breach, like spokes on a wheel. It looked reckless shells lying loose on the deck, violating every safety regulation ever printed. But DeAngelis had noticed that under fire, the violent rocking of the tank tended to dislodge shells from vertical racks anyway. His wheel stack kept them within arm's reach no matter how the vehicle jolted. He also filed down a small burr on the breech collar so the next shell would slide in without catching a trick he'd learned in the steel plant when feeding billets into rollers. When the commander shouted for armor piercing, Frank could grab the right type by feel alone. The shell tips were painted differently, but the driving bands felt distinct under his fingers. The crew joked that he'd turned the tank into a death trap. "One spark and we all go to God," the gunner muttered. Frank just shrugged. "Then we'll get there faster." That night, as the rest slept, he continued adjusting the stack, even cutting the laces off his boots to tie 2 shells together so they wouldn't roll. By dawn, he'd created a circular pattern of 12 rounds, ready to load in rapid succession. The opportunity, or the nightmare, arrived at 0600. German counterattacks along the Saint-Lô road had thrown the front into confusion. Lucky 4 was advancing behind an infantry company when a Panther A opened fire from a hedgerow less than 200 yards away. The first shell punched through the lead Sherman's turret, killing its crew instantly. The shockwave threw dirt and debris onto Lucky 4's glacis. Lieutenant Rowe barked, "Traverse left! Left! Target gun flash!" The gunner swung the turret. Frank was already hauling, around into the breach. "Up!" he shouted. The first shot fired armor-piercing capped, high velocity. It hit short, gouging the hedge bank. "Up!" Second round, within 4 seconds. This one struck the Panther's mantlet and ricocheted. Rowe later wrote that he could feel the tempo change inside the turret. There was no pause, no waiting for the breach to clear. The gun recoiled, the shell casing ejected, and before the gunner even finished reciting, another round was sliding home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the 5th shot, the Panther's crew realized they were being bracketed and began reversing. The 6th round penetrated just above the transmission, housing a lucky hit that ignited fuel lines. Flames burst through the driver's viewport. 12 shots in 1 minute. The Panther burned for hours. The after-action report described it dryly. Loader demonstrated exceptional speed and efficiency under fire. What it didn't describe was the transformation inside the crew's minds. To American tankers in Normandy, the German Panther and Tiger were nightmares of steel. Their guns outranged anything the M4 could field. Their armor seemed invincible. Crews entered battle half convinced that they would die without ever seeing their killer. For Lucky 4, that morning shattered the myth. DeAngelis's reckless system turned a mass-produced medium tank into a predator, if only for 60 seconds. Later inspection by maintenance officers confirmed that none of his modifications had damaged the weapon or breech. The only formal reprimand came from an ordnance inspector who noted improper ammunition storage practices. DeAngelis laughed when he read it. "Improper," he told Rowe, "saved your life." To grasp the irony, it helps to recall the U.S. Army's doctrine at that point. Sherman crews were trained to fire in deliberate, paced intervals. The manuals emphasized accuracy over volume, 1 shot, 1 kill. In theory, a calm, measured loader produced higher hit probability. In reality, most tank duels lasted less than 30 seconds. The battlefield had compressed time itself. What DeAngelis intuited was that survival depended not on deliberate precision but on overwhelming tempo. The faster his gun cycled, the less time the enemy had to adjust, re-aim, or retreat. He had reinvented, on a micro scale, the principle of suppressive fire for armored warfare. Decades later, a gunnery instructor at Fort Knox reviewing historical firing data from the 3rd Armored Division marked the 12-round burst as statistically improbable. He assumed it was an exaggeration. Then, when veterans of Lucky 4 were interviewed for an oral history project in 1988, 3 surviving crewmen confirmed it independently, even timing the sequence with their own watches during the retelling. "Frank wasn't the fastest loader," Gunner Bill Hayes said. "He was the calmest. He made the rest of us faster because he never looked scared." And that was the deeper truth hidden in that minute of gunfire. For a tank crew, fear was not noise or chaos. It was hesitation. The loader hesitates, the gunner waits, the commander overcorrects. In that gap, death enters. DeAngelis's so-called crazy stacking wasn't just about ergonomics or physics. It was about eliminating hesitation through design, turning chaos into rhythm. In his post-war letters, preserved by his family in Allegheny County, he wrote, "A tank is like a heartbeat. If you can hear it, you're still alive. So long as I can keep it beating, we'll make it home." That line became something of a legend in his battalion, scribbled in chalk on the sides of replacement Shermans delivered during the Ardennes campaign. Keep it beating. By the winter of 1944, the Army had quietly introduced a revised ammunition stowage plan, so-called wet stowage, in which shells were encased in anti-flash fluid containers to reduce fire risk. Ironically, this safer design made quick access harder, reducing loading speed. The system saved lives in catastrophic hits, but slowed rates of fire across the board. Somewhere between efficiency and survival, the Army had chosen survival. Frank DeAngelis, if he noticed, never complained. "I'll take luck over safety any day," he told a Stars and Stripes correspondent that December. The morning after the Panther burned, the hedgerow smelled of scorched oil and wet grass. The wreck still hissed where molten steel met dew. Inside Lucky 4, silence settled, a different silence than before battle. It was the sound of men realizing they were still alive. Frank DeAngelis sat cross-legged on the hull floor, wiping powder soot from his arms with a rag. Lieutenant Rowe leaned against the turret ring, studying him with a mixture of code, awe, and worry. "Frank," he said quietly, "you know they'll court-martial you if an inspector sees that setup." DeAngelis looked up, shrugged. "Then we'll win the trial faster than I can load a shell." 2 days later, an ordnance recovery team arrived to salvage the Panther. They measured the penetration hole, logged the coordinates, and interviewed Rowe's crew. One of the sergeants, a thin-faced engineer from Michigan, took meticulous notes. 75mm M61 APCBC, probably the 6th round, he muttered, crouching near the melted mantlet. Penetrated 73mm at 150 yards. Textbook lucky angle, Rowe corrected him. Not luck. 12 shells in 60 seconds. One had to hit. The engineer frowned. "Impossible. Manual rate's 8 rounds per minute." "Then your manual's too slow," Rowe replied. Within a week, word of the episode spread through the 32nd Armored Regiment. Crews joked that their new patron, Saint, was Saint Frank of the Breach. Others scoffed, assuming exaggeration. 12 rounds in 1 minute sounded like a fairy tale told to boost morale. But among loaders, curiosity replaced skepticism. Men began experimenting moving shell racks, clearing obstructions, memorizing the feel of casing types in darkness. Some copied Frank's circular floor stack, calling it the roulette. Others modified it, securing the shells with belts or wire. What had begun as one man's crazy idea had turned into an underground movement of loader innovation. Army doctrine hated improvisation. Every piece of equipment, every motion inside a Sherman, was standardized down to muscle memory. The loader's left hand, Manual 731A, declared, must grasp the base of the projectile while the right steadied the tip. Shells must be drawn from the ready rack nearest the gunner. No more than 3 should ever be unsecured at one time. Safety first, predictability second, initiative a distant third. The reasoning was sound. In training, accidents killed more crewmen than enemy fire. Shells fell, breaches jammed, men lost fingers. The discipline kept chaos at bay. But Normandy was chaos incarnate. After Saint-Lô, Lucky 4 rejoined the push toward Viry. The terrain worsened, narrow lanes, stone farm walls, constant ambushes. In that claustrophobic world, doctrine frayed. Crews swapped procedures for survival tricks. Some gunners preset range drums to typical hedgerow distances. Commanders used periscopes from destroyed tanks as makeshift mirrors to peek around corners. And loaders, those anonymous laborers of steel, rewrote the rules shot by shot. Not everyone celebrated. At battalion headquarters, Captain Miller, the ordnance officer, filed a complaint. Unauthorized modification of ammunition storage constitutes violation of safety protocols. Incident must not set precedent. He summoned Rowe and DeAngelis for questioning. The transcript survives in fragmentary form. In the National Archives, Miller. Private. Did you remove shells from prescribed racks during combat? DeAngelis. Yes, sir. Miller. Were they secured? DeAngelis. With shoelaces, sir. Miller. You understand that constitutes gross negligence. DeAngelis. I understand it saved 5 lives, sir. Rowe later wrote in his diary. Miller looked ready to explode but couldn't argue with results. Bureaucracy doesn't bleed, we do. No punishment followed officially because of exemplary performance under fire, unofficially because the regiment's morale needed heroes. Yet the encounter left DeAngelis unsettled. He'd glimpsed the wall between battlefield truth and institutional comfort. The wall, he knew, was thicker than any panther's armor. Historians sometimes reduce the story to a stunt of strength, but that misses the deeper calculation. To move a 20-pound projectile 12 times in 60 seconds means shifting roughly a quarter-ton of mass in a minute inside a space barely large enough for one man to stand. Each recoil shook the turret with a force of 10 tons. Each breech snap spat metal fragments and powder gas. The loader's hands blistered, lungs filled with carbon residue. After that minute of combat, Frank's pulse reportedly reached 165 beats per minute, and his arms were trembling uncontrollably. He was not superhuman. He was efficient. He had pre-visualized the sequence: body rotation, hand placement, stance. Like a factory worker repeating a single motion until muscle replaced thought, he'd automated survival. Modern ergonomic studies done decades later at Aberdeen Proving Ground tested veteran crews against reenacted turret mock-ups. The results confirmed that altering shell orientation and minimizing torso twist increased load rate by 40 to 60%. Frank's intuition had anticipated a half-century of military human factors science. By August, rumors of unsafe wheel stacking reached higher command. A memorandum from 1st Army Ordnance, dated 15 August 1944, stated, "Instances of non-standard ammunition placement have been observed among units of 3rd Armored Division. Such practices risk sympathetic detonation and are to be discontinued immediately." That same week, Lucky 4 was hit. The company was crossing a shallow valley near Le Désert when a concealed 75mm PaK-40 opened fire. The first round glanced off the turret cheek, the second penetrated the right sponson, igniting stored propellant bags. Flames raced along the rack seams. DeAngelis and Hayes barely escaped through the loader's hatch. Rowe was blown clear when the fire reached the ready rack. 2 crewmen died instantly. Frank watched from a ditch as his creation, the same pattern that had once saved them, became a furnace. The shells he'd laid out so neatly now cooked off in sequence, 12 rapid explosions pounding the valley like drumbeats. Afterward, when recovery teams found the charred hull, they counted blackened shell casings fused into the floor. The circular outline of his wheel was still visible, scorched into the steel. He spent 3 days in a field hospital, bandaged and silent. The doctors wrote, "Psychogenic shock." Rowe visited, one arm in a sling. "You couldn't have known," the lieutenant said softly. Frank stared at the ceiling. "I knew it could happen. I just thought we'd be faster than fire." That line haunted Rowe for the rest of his life. In post-war interviews, he described it as the moment when genius realized its price. When Frank returned to duty in September, he refused to modify racks again. "They want safe," he told Hayes. "I'll give them safe." He still loaded fast 5-6 rounds a minute, but the edge was gone. The rhythm that had once made the tank feel alive now seemed dangerous, almost treacherous. In November 1944, a Stars and Stripes reporter named Evelyn Westbrook joined the division to write a feature on unsung tank heroes. She'd heard whispers about a loader who beat the laws of physics. Her article, "The Man Who Outran the Gun," appeared on 10 December. It portrayed DeAngelis as a blue-collar prodigy, a Pittsburgh mill hand who turned a Sherman into a machine gun. The piece exaggerated, claiming 14 rounds in 55 seconds, but it electrified readers. Letters poured in. Mothers of tankers clipped it, pastors quoted it in sermons, and ordnance schools used it as motivational material. Frank never read it. "That guy they wrote about," he said, "he died in Lucky 4. Recognition had frozen him in myth, while the real man wrestled with guilt and survival. To understand why his minute mattered strategically, consider the cold numbers. In 1944, the average Sherman crew required 7 to 9 seconds per shot. German Tiger crews averaged 5. That 2-second edge often decided duels, but DeAngelis's method inverted the ratio. In that single engagement, an American tank achieved a fire rate twice that of its enemy. Even though his innovation couldn't be standardized, it was too unsafe. It demonstrated a truth the Army only later embraced. Speed of action can offset inferiority of design. After the war, American armor development focused on autoloaders and crew ergonomics. The Patton series adopted redesigned racks, shaped around loader reach arcs. By the time of the M60, every round sat angled toward the breech, precisely the geometry Frank had improvised under fire 30 years earlier. Frank survived the war, returning home in June 1945. He worked at the same steel plant where he'd once learned to feed billets. Colleagues said he flinched at sudden clangs but never spoke about tanks. In 1964, a historian collecting oral testimonies visited him. On the tape later transcribed for the U.S. Army Armor Center, his voice is low, deliberate. People think I was brave. I wasn't. I just hated wasted motion. In a tank, wasted motion kills. We were all trying to make time behave. When asked if he regretted the wheel stack, he paused. No. I regret that we stopped trusting our own hands. We built tanks, like factories build cars fast, replaceable. But inside, it's still one man loading one shell. If he can make that 1 second shorter, he wins. In 1988, during the oral history project Voices of Armor, surviving members of the 3rd Armored verified the 12-round story independently. Archivists cross-checked unit logs and found Rowe's combat report listing ammunition expenditure. 12 AP rounds, 0 HE, expended 06,05606 hours. The notation so terse, so bureaucratic became final proof. Military engineers at Fort Knox recreated the firing cycle on a simulator. They found that with optimized shell placement and trained rhythm, 12 rounds per minute was indeed physically possible. The myth had become measurable. What fascinated later psychologists was not the mechanics but the mindset. Tank combat compressed sensory input heat, vibration, noise into something close to sensory overload. To perform amid that required detachment bordering on trance. Frank's crazy stacking was as much a cognitive hack as an ergonomic one. By prearranging the physical world into predictable order, he reduced mental load to 0. He could move without deciding. That concept automation of stress behavior became central to modern soldier training. The U.S. Army's 21st century combat drills, emphasizing muscle memory and immediate response, echo the instinct of a single loader in 1944. In 1991, the Armor School introduced the Loader's Efficiency Program. Its manual included the line, "Speed and rhythm are survivability multipliers." The loader who anticipates the gunner's need preserves the crew. In the margins of one draft, an instructor scribbled, "DeAngelis Principle." Officially, the Army never used his name. Unofficially, everyone in the course knew the story. Frank DeAngelis died in 1993. At his funeral, fellow veterans placed a spent 75mm casing beside his casket. His nephew recalled that it rattled slightly as if still ready to load. On his tombstone, his family engraved only 4 words, "Keep it beating." In the decades since, historians have argued over how much his innovation changed anything. 12 shells in a minute did not win the war. It didn't redesign the Sherman or alter doctrine overnight. Yet in that moment, amid the hedgerows of Normandy, it inverted the hierarchy of fear. The Germans had built machines of perfection. The Americans, machines of abundance. Between those extremes stood one loader, proving that ingenuity could outpace both. There is a photograph grainy, taken after St. Lo, showing the crew of Lucky 4 beside their tank. The hull bears scorch marks, the men wear tired grins. In the center, Frank DeAngelis leans on a shell like a cane, eyes half shut, exhausted. Behind him, someone has chalked a phrase on the armor plate, 12 inches 60. It's not a boast. It's a measurement of life itself. Because in the brutal arithmetic of war, time is the only ammunition that never reloads. And for 60 seconds in 1944, one loader learned how to make it last forever. By the spring of 1945, the story of Private Joe DeAngelis had already begun to circulate through tank parks and motor pools far from his original unit. It spread not through official communiques or after-action reports, but in the oral folklore of the Armored Corps, the way myths usually do when they arise out of exhaustion and awe. A gunner who had transferred from the 2nd Armored Division to the 3rd claimed he'd once seen that mad loader from the 8th feed the gun faster than a German crew could traverse their turret. The next retelling improved the number 10 rounds, then 12, then 13. Someone said he'd been commended by General Patton himself, though the paperwork never materialized. In reality, DeAngelis's name barely appeared in the after-action summaries filed from the bridgehead at Wessel. The Army's concern, in those final months, was not how quickly one Sherman fired, but whether the Rhine crossings would hold under artillery, counter-battery fire. Yet within the 743rd Tank Battalion, the loader's crazy stacking became shorthand for an entire approach to survival, when the technical limit of a machine meets the human refusal to accept it. During refits in the Ruhr pocket, ordnance officers inspected several of the tanks that had seen action along the river crossings. One lieutenant noted that the ready racks, the 15 shells stored around the turret basket, had been rearranged in ways not described in the technical manual. The shells, normally placed nose forward in alternating horizontal layers, were found packed, vertically, with felt padding cut from seat cushions to prevent brass friction. Each round sat within easy reach of the loader's right hand. It violated every printed instruction about balance and recoil safety, yet none of the crews reported misfires. The officers quietly photographed the layout. Within a month, a circular labeled Improvised Ammunition Ready Rack Arrangement Field Evaluation appeared at Aberdeen Proving Ground. No mention of DeAngelis's name was made, only a note that crews in active combat zones have adapted loading protocol to increase rate of fire. Preliminary observation suggests improvement of 70 to 1 to 100%. That document, declassified in the 1990s, was later cited by historian Stephen Zaloga in his study of Sherman ergonomics. It was, in effect, the moment when a battlefield improvisation crossed into doctrine. After VE Day, the tank battalion was dissolved, and its men scattered into occupation duty or back to civilian life. DeAngelis returned to Pennsylvania, carrying in his duffel the same cracked gloves he had worn through Holland. He took a job at the Bethlehem steel plant, working the loading cranes that fed the open hearth furnaces. A local newspaper photographed him in 1947, one hand resting on a girder chain, captioned, "Veteran finds peace in steel." The reporter never learned that this quiet worker had once changed the rhythm of a tank's heartbeat. Yet his habit persisted. Former crewmen remembered that even on training days, DeAngelis arranged his lunchbox, tools, and cigarette tin on the bench, with the same geometric efficiency he'd used inside the turret. "Everything in reach, nothing wasted," he used to say. That was his creed, not speed for its own sake, but control within chaos. In 1948, an Army Field Forces Board conducted experiments on the new M26 Pershing's loader station. The report concluded that time to first an M, subsequent shots, is primarily a function of ammunition stowage and loader fatigue, not gun design. That phrasing, almost word for word, what DeAngelis had told his gunner 2 years earlier, would shape the ergonomics of every American tank that followed, from the Patton series to the Abrams. The engineers who wrote it probably never heard his name, but they inherited his insight, that war machines fight at the speed of their slowest human limb. Culturally, the loader remained the least celebrated member of any tank crew. The commander issued orders, the gunner made kills, the driver kept them alive. The loader existed in the periphery, sweating, bruised, invisible. Yet among veterans, that invisibility carried a quiet dignity. They understood that the moment between one empty breach and the next thunderclap determined whether the tank survived. In post-war memoirs, from Belton Cooper's Death Traps to Ken Tout's Tank, loaders are often described not as mere laborers but as musicians of motion, their bodies synchronizing with the recoil cycle until each shot felt like a heartbeat. DeAngelis's 12-round minute, though never officially confirmed, came to represent that fleeting perfection when man and machine reached the same tempo. One of his former crewmates, Sergeant Bill Hanrahan, wrote in a 1952 letter to a reunion committee, "You could tell Joe had fired a full rack by the smell. The air would hum with that sweet cordite note, and you'd swear the tank was breathing faster with him." That sentence later appeared, unattributed, in a training manual on gunnery rhythm compiled at Fort Knox. Such is the strange afterlife of battlefield prose, a loader's instinct reborn as bureaucratic language. By the time the Korean War began, the Sherman was already considered obsolete, yet hundreds of M4, A3S still served with U.S. and Allied forces. Many had their ready racks rebuilt according to lessons from Europe: vertical stowage near the loader's hip, foam separators, and quick-release straps. Officially, these were safety upgrades. Unofficially, they were the embodiment of a field loader's wartime improvisation. American armor schools began to include time-on-target drills that measured not just gunnery accuracy, but rate of sustained fire. The benchmark set in 1951, 12 rounds in 1 minute, was no coincidence. It was the whisper of a legend translated into policy. The irony, of course, is that automation soon made such feats irrelevant. By the 1960s, autoloaders in Soviet and later Western tanks reduced the loader's role or eliminated it entirely. The human rhythm that DeAngelis had perfected was absorbed into hydraulics. But even then, engineers designing the mechanical sequence looked back at human data, the average reach distance, the arc of motion, the reload interval, all first measured by men like him. Thus, the so-called crazy shell stacking became not a curiosity but a template. In historical retrospect, DeAngelis's achievement sits at the intersection of two paradoxes. The first is technological, that progress often begins with violation of manuals, of procedure, of fear. The second is psychological, that in war, mastery is a form of rebellion. He did not break rules for glory. He broke them to stay alive, and in doing so, redefined what safety meant. Archivists later found his notebook in a veteran's collection, a small ledger filled with sketches of turret interiors. On one page, beneath a crude diagram of shell racks, he had written, "Order is faster than strength." That single phrase captures the entire moral geometry of his craft. His story also illuminates a deeper irony in Allied tank warfare. For years, critics mocked the Sherman as a Ronson, the lighter that always lit because of its tendency to catch fire when penetrated. Yet that same cramped interior, with ammunition stored in every crevice, enabled DeAngelis's method. The weakness became the condition for speed. It was as if the tank's very flaw demanded a human correction. The mechanical engineers at Detroit Arsenal would later introduce wet stowage ammunition submerged in glycol water jackets to prevent cook-off. Safer, yes, but slower to access. The perfect balance between protection and readiness would remain elusive, and DeAngelis's wartime logic to place faith in motion rather than armor remains an unspoken counterpoint to post-war design philosophy. When veterans' oral histories were collected in the 1980s, one interviewer asked him whether the 12-round minute had truly happened. DeAngelis reportedly smiled and said, "Maybe it was 11, maybe 13. You don't count when your friends are dying." That answer, more than any stopwatch, defines the truth of his story. The feat was never about numbers. It was about transcending the paralysis that war imposes on men. To load faster than fear, that was the real miracle. He died in 1989, 2 weeks before his 65th birthday. His obituary mentioned his service in Europe and his 30 years at Bethlehem Steel. It did not mention the river crossings or the improvised racks. But among the tankers who still attended the reunions at Fort Indiantown Gap, a small tradition persisted. During the annual firing demonstration, one loader would attempt to match the mythical 12 rounds. None ever did. The ritual wasn't about success. It was homage to a rhythm that once saved their lives. In the broader story of the Second World War, DeAngelis's name will never appear beside generals or inventors. Yet his contribution belongs to that vast, invisible category of wartime innovation born from exhaustion rather than inspiration. Historians often focus on the machines, the armor thickness, the engine power, the range of the gun. But the war was, won, in countless small ways, by the men who changed how those machines were used. Every Sherman that rolled through Europe carried within its hull thousands of such anonymous adaptations. A gunner's bent periscope for quicker sight alignment, a driver's hand-cut wedge under his pedal to reduce fatigue, a loader's rearranged shells for faster fire. Together, these invisible modifications turned a mass-produced compromise into a living organism capable of surviving against supposedly superior enemies. And perhaps that is the deeper meaning of his crazy stacking. It wasn't insanity at all. It was the moment when improvisation became evolution, when a soldier's instinct corrected the limits of industrial design. In that sense, DeAngelis's turret in the mud outside Wesel was not merely a weapon. It was a laboratory of survival. And inside that metal cell, amid the noise and the smoke and the heat, one man's refusal to accept delay became, if only for 60 seconds, the purest expression of human intelligence in war, the mastery of time itself. In every army museum, there are displays of technology, the tangible artifacts of destruction. Cannons, armor plates, cutaway engines. They are silent, resting under the hum of fluorescent light, stripped of the voices that once animated them. But occasionally, if you stand beside one of those Shermans long enough, you can almost hear it, not the roar of the Ford GAA engine or the crash of its 75mm gun, but the faint clack thump of the loader's rhythm. That sound is gone from the world, yet it lingers in the imagination of those who study it. The rhythm of motion inside a turret, the heartbeat of a man wrestling time. Private Joe DeAngelis never patented his idea, never wrote about it, never sought validation. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary worker before and after the war. Yet in the crucible of combat, that ordinariness became a kind of genius. His crazy stacking was not a plan, written in a notebook. It was an act of embodied logic, born from muscle memory and desperation. And because of that, it transcended its moment. When engineers at the U.S. Army Armor Board revisited combat reports in the late 1940s, they drew up diagrams illustrating optimal ammunition placement. In one annotated schematic, there's a small notation, loader reach minimized, shells upright in concentric arc DeAngelis method, field. It's a rare official trace of a name that was never meant to survive. The rest was buried beneath layers of revisions and the onward rush of mechanization. But his principle that time itself could be weaponized would echo through the generations that followed. Tank doctrine evolved, computers replaced human loaders, infrared sights replaced periscopes, and yet the underlying philosophy endured. The most effective weapon was still not the fastest machine, but the human who found new rhythm inside it. The philosopher-historian Paul Virilio once wrote that to invent the ship is to invent the shipwreck. Every advance, he argued, carries its own catastrophe folded inside. DeAngelis's insight suggests the inverse, that to confront catastrophe is to invent the means of salvation. His 12-round minute wasn't progress designed in a lab. It was progress distilled from terror. And that kind of progress has always been the hidden engine of warfare, the small, human correction that makes the difference between theory and survival. The irony is that his gift for efficiency was forged in the least efficient enterprise imaginable, war itself. On the factory floor at Bethlehem Steel, he used the same timing he'd once used in the turret, calculating the swing of a crane chain, the angle of a girder, the gap between one shout and the next. Colleagues said he moved like a machine that had learned to breathe. He never told them why. In the 1960s, when the first generation of M60 tanks appeared with hydraulic rammers and semi-automatic loading assists, an Army training film showed the process of continuous feed firing. The narrator proudly announced, "Now, with modern engineering, our tanks can sustain 12 rounds a minute." Unknowingly, the film closed the circle. The loader's miracle had been absorbed, standardized, made mechanical, yet its origin remained the quick hands of a 22-year-old from Pennsylvania who, in the chaos of Wesel, had simply refused to be slow. What remains today of DeAngelis's world is mostly rust and testimony. A few surviving crewmen have spoken of the sensory fragments, the heat of brass, the stinging smell of propellant, the way the gun's recoil felt like being punched by God himself. In their memories, the speed of those 60 seconds is both infinite and instantaneous, a compression of life and death into a single rhythm. It is a reminder that history is not merely the sum of what was built, but of how men used what was built. The Sherman's real strength was never in its steel. It was in the hands that learned to coax one more second out of its limits. And in that sense, DeAngelis's legacy belongs to every nameless soldier who, faced with impossible machinery, found a way to make it human again. War historians often describe innovation under fire as a technical phenomenon, a new tactic, a better tool, a smarter code. But those terms are sterile. What DeAngelis achieved was emotional innovation, the reorganization of fear into precision. He transformed panic into order, and order into speed. That is why his act still feels relevant in an age when the battlefield has shifted from mud to microchips. Because the truth is, every generation faces its own version of the loader's dilemma. How do you keep moving when the system around you was never designed for your survival? How do you find rhythm in chaos? How do you make time serve you, instead of being consumed by it? For DeAngelis, the answer was tactile stack, align, reach, fire. For the rest of us, perhaps it is metaphorical. To find motion where there is none, to build structure within fear, to refuse paralysis. The Sherman tank in which he once fought now sits, restored, in an open-air museum in Ohio. Its olive paint is new, the breech is welded shut, the racks are empty. Visitors walk past it without noticing the subtle pattern of holes drilled into the ready rack non-standard, almost invisible. A curator once admitted they weren't factory-made. They match exactly the spacing of DeAngelis's vertical rack design, photographed in 1945. It's fitting that no plaque mentions his name. His contribution was never about recognition. It was about rhythm. And rhythm, unlike fame, does not die. It passes from motion to motion, from hand to machine, from fear to endurance, from war to peace. If you listen closely in that quiet hall, under the low ceiling and the smell of oil and dust, you might almost hear it. The echo of 12 thunderclaps in 1 minute, the sound of a loader who refused to let time dictate his fate, and the silence that followed the silence he bought for the men around him. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.